Get ready to blast off into the incredible world of brain-computer interfaces. Neurocareers Doing the Impossible is taking you on a journey to meet the fearless pioneers pushing the boundaries of what's possible. In this special series, we'll be shining a spotlight on the nominees and winners of the International BCI Award, one of the biggest and most prestigious awards in the BCI world. You'll hear from BCI professionals as they share their revolutionary work and get a behind-the-scenes sneak peek at what it takes to be a winner. So, buckle up, grab a snack, and get ready to be amazed as we explore the impossible becoming a reality in the world of BCIs. But before we blast off, I want to give a big thanks to the co-host of this BCI Award edition on our podcast, Dr. Christoph Guger and G-Tech Medical Engineering. When I was a faculty member at the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, my team and I did some pretty amazing stuff for patients needing epilepsy surgery. We would put special sensors, also called grids, directly on their brain to prepare for surgery and create maps of their brain in a much faster and safer way than is usually done. It's called high gamma mapping, and it lets us figure out in just a few minutes the essential parts of the brain that need to be spared during surgery. Can you imagine? You can create a map of language, motor, and even math processing in no time. It was the first time this innovative technology was used at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. When I moved to Florida, I established the first functional brain mapping and BCI program at Florida Hospital. I continue to use high gamma mapping to help epilepsy patients avoid losing their ability to speak or move after surgery. But even cooler than that, I created brain-computer interface studies that let patients control things with their brain in real time. Our patients could even spell words with incredible speed by just using their brains. No hands involved. I also discovered that brain-computer interfaces could help patients move their chronically impaired hands or legs years after a stroke when not much else could help them. So, I started working with the faculty from Advent Health University to help these patients restore their ability to use their hands. I received special training for it, and it's still mind-blowing how cool it is. My favorite part of what I do is teaching. At my established Institute of Neuro Approaches, I've integrated all my experience and knowledge into a unique course on brain-computer interfaces. With graduate neurobiology students, we started with theory, and then I gave them the BCI equipment so they could have hands-on experience working with BCIs. It significantly improved the way students learn, and they absolutely love this practical part of learning how to use neurotechnology. And all of this was made possible thanks to G-Tech's awesome brain-computer interface technology. They have everything from high-tech up to 1024-channel EEG systems to wearables, tools for neurorehabilitation, such as the medical grade system recoveries and educational kits with unicorn hybrid plug for learning how to work with BCI technology. But the most important part is their support and care. I have enjoyed working and collaborating with Dr. Christoph Guger and GTEC employees for over 15 years, and I hope for many more successful years ahead. So, if you are interested in GTEC's brain-computer interfaces and neurotechnologies, check out their website at gtech.ed. It's worth it. Thank you very much for joining us today. Can you please introduce yourself and let us know where you are joining us from what part of the world?
Hi, Melina. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm joining from Austin, Texas. So I'm a final year PhD student in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm advised by Dr. Alex Huth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And can you give us a little bit a glimpse into your background? How did you get to this stage where you are already finishing your PhD and doing such an amazing work that we will be talking about? Where did it all start?
So I guess the seed was kind of planted in high school. So I was a counselor at a summer camp for kids with disabilities. And so I spent a lot of time working with kids who struggled to speak due to conditions like cerebral palsy. And so this was a really formative experience for me. The kids were really awesome. And I just enjoyed learning about their lives and trying my best to help them have a good time. And this is kind of an experience that just stuck with me. So in college, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, I thought back to this experience a lot, and I thought that it'd be an exciting and meaningful career to help people with communication disorders. So that's kind of what got me into neuroscience. And the timing there was pretty good because when I was about to graduate college, it was a really good time to be applying like tools in machine learning to problems in neuroscience. And I had studied computer science in college. So I applied to work with Alex Huth, who was interested in similar types of things. And he was just setting up a lab. So I was excited to work in a new and exciting lab. And I thought his previous papers and also his general approach to science were both really cool and interesting. So that's kind of how I got into neuroscience and also into the lab that I'm currently in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely beautiful story and very motivational, very inspirational. Can you tell us what type of neuroscience did you study? So that was, as I understand, your bachelor's degree, correct, in neuroscience? And how did you combine at one point with the computer science?
Yeah, my bachelor's degree was actually in computer science. But in college, I was interested in problems in neuroscience. So I did a bit of neuroscience research in college. And then I worked with Dr. Huth, who also has a similar background. I think his bachelor's is also in computer science or some kind of information processing. And his research is on like applying tools from machine learning to brain data.
Mm-hmm. What helped you? Did you take any additional classes to get that perspective into neuroscience, neuroimaging? How did you acquire all the necessary knowledge that you are using right now?
Yeah. So in the second half of college, I took a couple of classes on like cognitive science and computational neuroscience, neurobiology. So I got a bit of exposure there. And then I did some neuroscience research with Dr. Adrian Fairhall. So there we mostly looked at like developing computer vision pipelines for tracking cells. So that was one research experience I had in college. And then I did my senior thesis with Dr. Sam Gershman. So there I was developing computational models of memory and cognition. So through both of these experiences, I also got to kind of work at the intersection of computer science and neuroscience. And I think that set me up well for starting my PhD.
Yes, absolutely. So now about your PhD. What are you exploring in your PhD thesis? What is the main maybe problem you want to solve?
So I'm generally interested in understanding how language is processed in the brain, and also in the relationship between language and other processes such as vision. So early on in my PhD, I did a lot of work looking at the relationship between representations of language and vision. But over the last few years, the main focus of my PhD was on decoding language from non-invasive brain recordings. So those are a couple of the types of projects that I worked on.
Mm-hmm. And your work on decoding language from non-invasive brain recordings was nominated for BCI Award in 2023. So let's talk about this particular project. First of all, why non-invasive brain recordings? Why do you want to use non-invasive brain recordings to decode language?
Yeah, so Alex Huth's lab is mostly an fMRI lab. So we record brain responses while subjects listen to just narrative stories. And over the first few years of being in the lab, we collected this really large natural language fMRI data set. So around 16 hours of story listening data from each participant. So we thought that it would be really interesting to test language decoding on this data that we already have. So I think the non-invasive components is a big part of our study. So a lot of existing BCIs use implanted electrodes, and we want to see whether we can eventually offer a non-invasive alternative that doesn't require any neurosurgery. And I think another advantage of using functional fMRI is that it allows us to target different types of representations. So in our decoder, we target semantic representations, which encode the meaning of language. So a lot of existing BCIs target motor representations, and these are designed to help people with conditions like anarthria, so people who struggle to translate motor plans into muscle movements. But there are also a lot of people with damage to an earlier stage of language production. So for instance, people with aphasia often struggle to translate their thoughts into words or their thoughts into motor plans. And so we think that decoding semantic representations is the best way to help these kinds of people. And because fMRI allows us to image the whole brain at once, we can kind of access these semantic representations that represent high-level meaning. So we're excited about the prospect of using non-invasive decoding to help people with aphasia and bring BCIs to kind of a different patient population.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, it makes total sense. And thank you very much for delineating those differences, decoding motor representation versus semantic representation and meaning. It definitely makes sense. I understand that you want to provide opportunities for people with aphasia and some similar conditions to be able to produce meaningful speech. Yes, directly decoding the information from the brain. That would be the ultimate goal. Is that correct?
That's right.
And of course, we also know that fMRI, this is the huge machine. Yes, it's not portable. The participant can come and visit maybe, just for a couple of hours while this information is being recorded and then decoded. So how this problem can be solved maybe in the future, because people, at least at this moment of fMRI development, cannot be using it in real settings, in real life. So what is going on? Yes, maybe there are some developments that you are aware of.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something that we've been thinking a lot about. So we think of our fMRI study as kind of a proof of concept that non-invasive language decoding is possible. In the future, we're hoping to test whether our approach can be translated to brain recordings from more portable devices, since obviously fMRI is not very practical, like you just mentioned. So we think that one really exciting alternative is something called fNIRS, so functional near-infrared spectroscopy. This is kind of a portable and much cheaper way of measuring a similar signal as functional MRI, but doing so using like a portable cath instead of this large, like very expensive, very heavy scanner. So we're excited about testing our approach using brain recordings from fNIRS and seeing if we can do the same kind of non-invasive decoding using more portable devices. So that's definitely a big direction that we want to focus on moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now you have a proof of concept, and then you will be moving further already towards some other alternatives. Let's look at the study. So you mentioned, and it's mentioned in the paper, that you had a large amounts of data. You have about 15, 16 hours of language recordings. And this is for each participant, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
How many participants did you have in your study?
So in this study, we had 3 participants. And like you said, we recorded 16 hours of data from each participant while they listened to naturalistic narrative stories.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And of course, 16 hours, I'm just imagining it's a very big number, yes, for laying an fMRI machine and listening. And of course, participants need to be as still as possible in order not to produce artifacts. So how did you handle this problem? Did your participants come on separate sessions? What was the maximal time that they spent in the scanner, and how did you make them comfortable so that they wouldn't move much? So what were those methodological considerations that allowed you to record high quality data?
Yeah, so 16 hours is definitely a lot of data. We collected this data over the course of many scans in many weeks. So each of our scanning sessions is just 2 hours long, and we get 1 hour of like language data in each session. So the participants came back for like 15 of these 2-hour sessions. We tried to get better like signal by stabilizing the participants' heads using like a custom designed head case. So this is something that Alex helped develop during his PhD. So each participant gets their own head case, which kind of fits snugly around their head and helps prevent movement. And also, we just generally try to choose like engaging and entertaining stories. So these are stories taken from podcasts that a lot of people would just listen to on their own anyway. So we hope that because our stimuli are engaging and interesting, that it's a reasonably fun type of experiment for our participants. And a lot of our participants report like enjoying the stories and like being moved by the stories. So we think this is part of why we're able to get so much data from each person.
Yes, that makes sense. And as you started already talking about the stimuli, about those stories that people listen to, how did you select, what type of stories, what type of podcasts? Was it just by popularity, or you had already certain things in mind? What type of stories do you want to present?
Yeah, so a lot of our work builds on work done by Alex during his PhD. So Alex has a paper from 2016 that introduced this kind of like natural language fMRI experiments. There, they collected 2 hours of data from each participant, and they chose stories from the Moth Radio Hour, which is a narrative storytelling podcast. I think they did a lot of iteration with like which types of stimuli they would use, and they found that stories from the Moth were really engaging and led to good data quality. So these stories contain many different types of concepts. They cover things from like baseball to family relationships to careers. So they really help us like kind of span the space of ideas and concepts that we would like to decode. And so we've kind of just stuck with these types of stories, but we're definitely also thinking about in the future, like moving past just narrative stories and including other types of stimuli in order to better map like other types of information.
Thank you. And also, your study mentions that the decoder that you created generates intelligible word sequences that recover the meaning of perceived speech, imagined speech, and even silent videos. So you mentioned that they were listening to the stories. Did you also record brain activity while they were imagining and how they were imagining? And silent videos. So can you elaborate more on those other stimuli?
Yeah. So in order to train our decoder, we only trained it on responses to perceived speech. So just these responses while the participants were listening to stories. But then we tested our decoder on a bunch of different stimuli. So like you mentioned, for one of the experiments, we had our same participants go back into the scanner, and then we recorded them while they imagined telling stories. So we gave them a couple of short 1-minute stories to memorize. And then we had them go in the scanner, and then they would be prompted with each of these stories, and they would imagine telling the story in their head without moving at all. So this was kind of our imagine speech experiment. We wanted to see if we can train the decoder on responses to perceived speech and then use it to decode responses to imagine speech. Because we think that like in practice for the patients that we're trying to help, like what we want to be able to decode is like the words and ideas that they're thinking about without like making any movements, without hearing anything external. And so here we found that you can train a decoder on responses to perceived speech, and it turns out that it's actually pretty good at decoding responses to imagined speech. And we took this to indicate that like perceived speech and imagined speech might rely on shared semantic representations. So that was one of the experiments. And then after that, we asked whether we can push this further. So it seems like semantic representations are already shared between perceived and imagined speech. We wanted to see like what else has shared representations with language. So one kind of task that people have studied before is vision. So a lot of studies have suggested that language and vision rely on shared representations. So like the pattern of brain activity when seeing a dog might be similar to the pattern of brain activity when hearing the word dog or just like imagining a dog. So we wanted to see if we can take our decoder that was just trained on responses to perceived speech and then use it to decode responses while the participants just watch movies. So we had them watch a bunch of like silent, short animated films. So these movies don't contain any language. The participants weren't instructed to like generate any language. They're just told to watch the movies. And it turns out that our decoder could produce a sequence of words that describes what's going on in the movies. So we took this to suggest that like this was further evidence that language and vision relied on similar representations. And we took it to suggest that our decoder is really operating on these like high-level representations of meaning that are shared between language and other cognitive processes.
Mhm. And what was the difference in decoding accuracy when you were trained the model on perceived speech and decoding perceived speech versus using, again, decoder trained on perceived speech, but trying to decode imagined speech, and the third condition, just silent videos?
Yeah, so we found that decoding performance was highest when testing our decoders on perceived speech. We think this makes sense because it's the domain that it was trained on. We found that decoding performance fell a bit when transferring to imagined speech and to perceived movies. So this suggests that like perceived speech does share representations with these other tasks, but they're not entirely overlapping. There are some differences that make it's not a perfect transfer process. So we think that in the future, if we wanted to create a decoder that's better at decoding responses to imagined speech, we might combine training data from perceived speech experiments and imagined speech experiments.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting and amazing results, and that shared representation, which adds, again, some knowledge about how we process information. What is going on in the world? What studies are already out there that are working on decoding speech non-invasively? So I just want to establish some background, then to see what you did differently and maybe what innovations did you create, yes, in your study.
So there are a lot of previous studies on non-invasive language decoding, but these studies typically only decode a closed set of possibilities. So given a brain recording, these previous decoders can predict what the user is thinking out of a small set of letters or words or sentences. So in our study, we wanted to reconstruct continuous language. So instead of being limited to a closed set of possibilities, we wanted our decoder to be able to reconstruct like arbitrary sequences of words. And this would make the decoder much more flexible and also more expressive. So yeah, we wanted to move from this type of like identification to reconstruction. And reconstruction has previously been done for images and videos. So a lot of this early work was done in Jack Gallant's group. So studies led by Kendrick Kay, Thomas Nazalaris, and Shinji Nishimoto. And so our study basically adapts this framework for reconstruction. And we would just take this approach and then applied it to language data.
Very good. Now let's get into another obstacle that you were working with them and trying to overcome. It's a low temporal resolution of fMRI. Yes, so how did you deal with that problem? And maybe you can just briefly describe to our listeners the problem in a nutshell for those who are not very familiar with that, and then how did you approach it?
Yeah. So fMRI doesn't actually record neural activity directly. Instead, it records a metabolic signal that's a very slow proxy for neural activity. So neurons require oxygen. And so when neurons in a brain region fire, the blood flow to that region increases in order to provide more oxygen. And it turns out that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood have different magnetic properties. And this is what fMRI is measuring. It uses this giant magnet in order to detect changes in blood flow and predict which brain regions are active. So the issue here is that this metabolic signal is much slower than the actual neural activity. So after an impulse of neural activity, this fMRI signal can take over 10 seconds to rise and then fall. And so for a long time, people thought that fMRI was too slow to decode continuous language. So with a lot of implanted electrodes, you can fit a decoder that just takes the recorded brain activity and map that onto characters or words or phonemes. But for fMRI, our issue is that each brain image can contain information about over 20 words. So we couldn't just directly fit a model that goes from a brain image to the stimulus. Instead, we kind of have to do the opposite approach. So in our study, we used a framework for reconstructing images in movies from fMRI, and we adapted it for language. So the key idea of this approach is that we don't fit a model that goes from brain responses to stimuli. Instead, we fit a model that goes from stimuli to brain responses. So this is something that we call an encoding model. So we want to fit this encoding model that can take in any sequence of words and then predict how the user's brain would respond when thinking about those words. So we train this model on brain responses while the user listens to 16 hours of stories. So our data set is, we get a paired data set where on one hand we have the words that the user was hearing. On the other hand, we have the recorded brain responses. And now it's just like a machine learning problem where we want to go from the stimulus words to the brain responses. So we fit this model. And then after we have this model, we kind of invert it in order to decode new brain recordings. So basically, in order to do this, we want to generate word sequences that make the predicted responses under our encoding model look as similar as possible to the actual recorded responses. So this is kind of like a guess and check system. We want to generate a bunch of word sequences. For each word sequence, we predict how the user's brain would respond. And then we compare these predicted responses to the actual responses. And if the predicted responses look like the actual responses, then we can say that a word sequence is probably similar to the actual words that the user was thinking. So that's how our decoder works at a high level. We basically fit a model of the user's brain that goes from words to brain responses. And then we kind of use this model to constrain the generation of word sequences.
Yeah, very interesting approach. A couple of other questions about your methodology. There is always a problem of finding a right control task to your active task. Yes, your active task are stories that you were presenting, and to have that successful subtraction between active and control to really delineate that meaning, yes, from words. So it's important to have a good control condition. So what was your control condition in this study? How did you choose it? Based on which criteria?
I think one of the unique aspects of the work that we do in Alex's lab is that we don't do this kind of controlled experiments, because in a controlled experiment, you want to kind of isolate a variable of interest, and you want to design stimuli that differ along this one dimension. But we're working with these like high-level representations of meaning, which is like a very high-dimensional signal. And if we wanted to assess meaning using like classical controlled studies, this would require like many different types of contrasts, like many different types of experiments. So what we do in our lab is this kind of like naturalistic experiment design, where we just collect responses to like a large set of naturalistic stimuli. And our goal is to train models that can go from the stimuli to the brain responses. So this is purely just a kind of a machine learning predictive problem. We want to take the words that the user was hearing and build a machine learning model that can predict how the user's brain responds to those words. So a lot of like the hypotheses about what the brain is representing, this gets moved from like the experimental design stage to the data analysis stage. So a lot of like the questions that we grapple with are like, what types of features should we use to represent each word in order to predict brain responses?
Very interesting approach. And how this approach, in your experience, is more advantageous than a conventional approach. The result that you get, how they differ from the results when people are using this conventional control active condition approach.
I think, like I mentioned, one of the big advantages is that we can work with this really naturalistic, rich stimuli, and then we can kind of model these like high-dimensional semantic representations that are kind of hard to characterize along like a single dimension. So using this encoding model framework, we can basically test a bunch of hypotheses using the same data set. So in our lab, we collect this one really large data set of responses to narrative stories, but we can evaluate a bunch of different types of hypotheses using this single data set. So if we wanted to study like lower level acoustic processing, we can try to model the brain responses using acoustic features of the stimuli. If we wanted to model like a higher level semantic processing, we can represent the stimuli using higher level semantic features. So I think one of the major advantages of this kind of naturalistic design is that you can collect just a single data set and use it to answer many different types of questions.
Definitely. A very interesting approach. Thank you very much for talking about it. Also, I'm very curious. It's just some question that popped up. You used 3 Tesla MRI scanner, yes, in your study. And now there is this push towards stronger magnets. Many laboratories start to switch to 7 Tesla MRI machines and so on and so forth. Do you think there is any advantage of using stronger magnet machines in this type of studies? Do you think you would be able to collect the data that can be decoded, better if you use stronger magnet MRI machines?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's something that we've thought about before. We've talked to collaborators about collecting 7T data. I don't have a great sense of how this would work. I think if I had to guess, if we used just a stronger scanner, we might get like higher data quality, and this would lead to better decoding performance. I'm not entirely sure like how much better this would make our decoder. Right now, we've been thinking more about trying to move our decoder to more portable devices like fNIRS, but we think that testing this approach on 7T data could also be interesting. I think that's also something that could lead to, like, if there's a big jump in decoding performance when we move from 3T to 7T data, this could indicate that like a big bottleneck of our decoder is just data quality at this point. And that would be really important to know.
Mm-hmm. So what were the main challenges with your decoding process and how did you solve those challenges?
I think one of the big challenges is that our decoder has a bunch of different moving parts. So we have a model that like predicts word times, predicts when each word was heard or imagined. We have a model that generates word sequences. We have a model that scores these word sequences against brain responses. So because there's so many different components, sometimes it's hard to know which component is the bottleneck. So like if decoding performance is lower than we want, sometimes it's hard to know like which of these different components to improve, or like what kinds of changes to our model will lead to the most improvements. So sometimes I'll spend like many weeks working on one part of the decoder, trying to just like make things better, and it wouldn't really go anywhere. And then I just move to a different component and then immediately find better results if I change that component. So I think like one of the big challenges is just like figuring out where we can get improvements in performance from. And also like, can we improve things further? Like, what's the limit on how well we can decode? At what point is our decoder bottlenecked by the data quality as opposed to our models? I think that's like a bit of an unknown. So it's hard to decide like when to just say, this is as good as we can do for now, let's publish a paper, as opposed to like trying to push further on the model and improve performance.
Mm-hmm. What were the main innovations in how you approached your decoding process? Maybe something that hasn't been done before, but that you push the envelope of what's possible.
In our decoding study, we basically took tools that are already out there, but we kind of combined them in new ways. So there's already like a pretty well-established framework for reconstructing stimuli from functional MRI. So this framework for reconstructing like images and videos from fMRI data is something that a lot of people have already worked on before. There are also a lot of good models of language processing in the brain. There's already been like a lot of studies using encoding models to assess different components of language processing. And so basically we just took these two tools, this framework for decoding and these like powerful language encoding models, and we just like combined them and also like incorporated a very large natural language data set. So we used many more hours of data than a lot of previous studies. And I think by like combining these existing tools in new ways is how we got a lot of our more novel results.
Mm-hmm. And now, as you already started talking about the results, yes, you just mentioned that at the end, can you maybe state what were your main goals for the study? Of course, you mentioned that a proof of concept, but maybe more clear goals of the study and now the results that you got in the study.
Yeah. So the main goal of the study was to test whether we can reconstruct language from non-invasive brain recordings. So we want to see if we can just take an fMRI scan from our participants and predict the words that they were hearing or imagining. And so we found that we can, by training a decoder on brain responses while the participants listens to stories, we are able to decode new brain responses while the participants listens to stories, but also while the participant imagines telling stories. And so ultimately where we see this leading is we want to build interfaces where people with communication disorders such as aphasia can just think of an idea that they want to convey, and our decoder can predict the words that they're thinking about based on their brain recordings.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And my next question is about the brain activity that you used for the decoding purposes. Did you choose any particular networks that were activated, or maybe you had certain regions of interest? And I know you mentioned this in your article, so maybe you can elaborate more on that. What did you use and what was the reason for that?
So one of the advantages of fMRI is that we can measure responses across the entire brain. fMRI has very high spatial coverage and also high spatial resolution. And this is important for measuring like semantic representations, because semantic representations are highly distributed throughout the brain. So for a lot of our main decoding analyses, we just used like full brain data. So we used responses in brain regions that we've previously found to be responsible for language and semantic processing. So broad regions of prefrontal cortex and parietal temporal cortex. But then in our study, we also looked at like what brain regions are necessary for decoding. So say we only wanted to decode from prefrontal cortex, or say we only wanted to decode from right hemisphere, would we still be able to like accurately decode language? And so one of the findings that I thought was really interesting is that we found that we can get pretty accurate decoding if we use like any brain region in any hemisphere. So if we like just look at right hemisphere prefrontal cortex or like left hemisphere posterior regions, we find similar decoding performance. So we took this to suggest that like the semantic representations that we are decoding from are like highly distributed throughout the brain, but also pretty redundant. So it seems like the semantic representations that are represented in one part of the brain are also represented in other parts of the brain. So we think that this is quite interesting. We're still trying to unpack like what this means, whether there are differences between these regions. And we think that practically this suggests that even if someone has damage to one region of the brain, we might be able to decode semantics from a different region.
That is absolutely amazing. How does this correspond to the current knowledge that currently is available?
Yeah, so there's kind of a debate about like how semantics and language are represented in different brain regions. So in a lot of Alex's early work, he found that like a lot of the brain is responsible for semantic processing, which I think was a pretty surprising result at the time. Just like how vast this semantic network was, how bilateral it was. So our results kind of support Alex's early findings that like a lot of the brain is involved in semantic processing, and that a lot of the representations in these regions are redundant. I think it's important to note that we're not making any causal claims here. So it could be the case that like if like one brain region is damaged, that will affect the representations in other brain regions as well. And we do have a lot of people in the lab that are looking at like the finer grain differences between these regions. So our study shows that like if we wanted to decode language, if we wanted to just like do semantic decoding, it works no matter like whether you use like left or right hemisphere, whether you use like anterior or posterior regions. But like at a finer grain, what's going on in these different areas, it's still like a very open question. And I'm excited to see like the kind of work that gets done towards this direction in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Were there any differences in the decoder performance when you tried to decode from different areas of the brain?
Yeah, so the main areas that we tested were like left and right hemisphere, and then anterior and posterior regions. And so we found that for each of these like 4 subregions, decoding performance was like highly similar. So like the decoder predictions from like left anterior regions was highly similar to the decoder predictions from right posterior regions. And there was an analysis that we did early on where we tried to look at like the differences in what we can decode from these different regions, but we didn't see anything that was super notable. It seems like at least what the decoder is recovering seems to be very consistent across these different regions.
Yeah, that's a fascinating result. I would love to learn more and more from your future studies. My next question is, how big should be the area from which you are decoding in order to have your optimal decoder performance? So you already are saying that basically it doesn't matter from what region we're sampling, but how extensive should be that region? What is the extent?
That's something that I'm quite interested in, but we haven't really assessed yet. So that's not something that we looked at in this study. But I think in the future, I'm interested at the idea of like using fMRI decoding as a way of selecting regions for implanted electrodes to see if we can use our work to help like localize electrodes for existing implanted approaches. And so there, I think it'd be interesting to try to decode from like smaller and smaller regions and see like just how much brain coverage is needed in order to get good decoding performance. So I don't have a great answer for that yet, but I think that's something that'd be really interesting to look into moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. And what can be that minimal coverage, yes, that we need in order to decode the signal, which is very important. So in general, in the future, you are considering both approaches, yes, and improve implantation type of speech decoding and also non-invasive. Yes, do you think that in some cases one might be more advantageous than another? And if so, in which cases do you think would be more recommended, one or another type?
Yeah, I haven't worked with implanted decoders before, but I think that if there's a way of kind of combining the insights of our work to help guide existing like implanted approaches, that'd be really great. I think like right now, implanted approaches are a lot more accurate than our work. I think they're just like a lot further along. In the long term, I'd love to be able to offer like a non-invasive alternative to a lot of existing approaches. But I think right now, like since our decoder is not quite there yet in terms of like accuracy and also like portability, practicality, I think it'd be great if we could use like insights from our non-invasive decoding studies to help guide existing like implanted BCIs.
Mm-hmm. And how far other imaging modalities, non-invasive modalities such as EEG or maybe MEG, magnetoencephalography, how far are they from this encoding accuracy that now you showed with the fMRI, are those also maybe possible feasible options to use for non-invasive language BCIs?
I think that more portable, non-invasive techniques are all really interesting. So like EEG, MEG, fNIRS. We've been mostly focusing on thinking about fNIRS since it operates on a very similar signal as fMRI. But I think if there's a way to get like accurate language reconstruction using EEG or MEG, that would also be really powerful. I haven't worked with these types of techniques before, but that's something I'd be very interested in, like pursuing moving forward, especially as we start thinking about how to take the decoders and the principles that we've established so far and make them more practical.
Yes, very good and very interesting, especially the technologies are developing. For example, GTEC has now a new system, Pangolin, that can have up to 1024 electrodes, and they provide actually very high spatial resolution and temporal resolution. So I immediately thought of that might be something, interesting to try. Especially it already shows that you can decode individual finger movements from it. And so from motor task perspective, it already is showing great results. Okay, so we'll be looking forward to your studies. Now, very interesting aspect of your study that you actually considered the ethical implications of research, yes, of this type of studies and this type of decoding of language. Can you elaborate more on that? Why did you think that was important? What are possible problems that can arise, and what did you demonstrate in your studies to alleviate those ethical concerns?
We think that mental privacy is really important and that nobody's brain should be decoded without their cooperation. This is an idea that motivated us from the beginning. This is something that we wanted to think about throughout the entire course of developing our decoder. And so we tested this in a couple of different ways. So during COVID, we couldn't collect any new data. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the types of experiments that we might design in order to test how much our decoder relies on a person's cooperation. So first we tested this at training time. So we tested whether cooperation is required to train the decoder. And so we found that you can't just train a decoder on one person and then run it on a different person. So our decoder operates on these fine-grained semantic representations. And it seems like for now, we need some amount of training data from the person being decoded. So that's at training time. We also tested whether a person's cooperation is required to run the decoder. So here we did a couple of attention experiments. So for instance, having a person listen to two stories at once, but only pay attention to one or the other. And so we found that our decoder only reconstructs what a person is actively thinking about. So in our study, this was a really strong effect. If you play someone two stories at once and you tell them to listen to one story, then you can't really decode anything about the other story that they're not thinking about. We took this as evidence that our decoder relies on a person's attention, that a person can actively control what is being decoded. And then so building off of this, we also found that people can sabotage a decoder by performing simple tasks. So if we have a person listen to a story, but tell them to perform imagined tasks like naming animals, we found that this really just makes the decoder predictions meaningless. We think that for now, a person's cooperation is required to train and to use our decoder. But like obviously technology can change and improve. So our goal here wasn't to give like a false sense of security. We just wanted to like start a conversation around mental privacy and brain decoding. And we wanted to like provide a framework that other researchers can use in order to assess the privacy implications of their future models. So like overall, long term, we hope that our research can help guide the formation of policies that protect mental privacy.
Thank you so much. And can you tell our listeners what was the decoding accuracy that you achieved and how is it comparable to the currently existing achievements in this area, both for invasive and non-invasive studies?
In terms of comparisons with non-invasive studies, it's hard to directly compare because we're ultimately doing different things. So in our study, our goal is to reconstruct continuous language, whereas previous studies, they tried to predict what a user was thinking about out of a closed set. So because we're operating on different types of stimuli, it's hard to compare. I think there the difference is a lot more qualitative in terms of like what types of information we can decode, like how much expressivity the models have. In terms of comparisons with implanted approaches, this is also really interesting because our decoder operates on these like high-level semantic representations. So generally we found that our decoder predictions recover like the high-level meaning of what a user was hearing or thinking, but it doesn't always do this using the exact words. So we found that we actually have a pretty high word error rates. And so for a while, we were kind of stuck on like, how exactly do we measure how well our models are doing? But it turns out that there are like metrics that can take two word sequences and quantify their similarity of meaning. So these are like more recent, like deep learning based metrics where you can just like take two sequences of words and assign a similarity score that's not based on just like word matches. So under these types of metrics, our model does like quite good. I feel like it's hard to compare this to previous approaches because I don't know of any other decoding papers that use like this similar kind of semantic metric. So yeah, I think evaluating our models and like comparing it to previous work was a big challenge for us that took us a while to figure out. One experiment we did was that's like a bit more interpretable is we want to see like if we have decoder predictions, like do they actually capture the meaning of what a person was thinking? So in this study, we decoded responses while participants listened to stories. And then separately, we wrote multiple choice questions based on the stimulus stories. And we had a different set of participants try to answer these multiple choice questions based on only the decoder predictions. And we found that we wrote 16 questions. I think 9 of the questions were answered at like a substantially above chance percentage. So we think that like 9 out of 16 times the decoder might get the meaning of what the person was thinking in like an interpretable enough way that other people can understand what it's producing.
Mhm. What was the most challenging part for you of this whole study?
One challenge was just thinking like proactively about the implications of decoding technology. So like thinking about implications for mental privacy and trying to come up with a new set of like tests for evaluating like how much a decoder respects mental privacy. I feel like that's not something I'd really seen before. So it was a lot of like just reading papers about like neuroethics and mental privacy and trying to come up with a new set of experiments for evaluating this. So I think there was a lot of like coming up with stuff from scratch. Another challenge was just like the open-endedness of decoding, especially like early on when the decoder predictions weren't as high as we would have liked. We weren't entirely sure how good our model could be. So like early on when we weren't getting good results, I think it required a lot of conviction to like keep on moving forward with it and like having just like the belief that I'd be able to, or like when we weren't getting good results, like having the belief that we'll be able to like push through them and make things better.
What was the one most unexpected thing you learned during this process of working on this study?
So one thing that surprised me was like the importance of accurately communicating our work to the public, especially with like BCIs and decoding when there's a lot of public interest. I think it's really important to find a way of communicating your work in a way that people can understand, but like still being really precise about what you're doing. So I thought that was an interesting challenge that I grew a lot from just like going through this like publication process. Another like surprise was just like in terms of the results, like finding that like a decoder trained on one type of task can be used to decode many different types of tasks. So a decoder trained on perceived speech could be applied to responses during imagined speech and movie watching. So this was pretty unexpected to me, and I think really came to show how much these different processes rely on shared representations and how our decoder really seems to be operating on these high-level semantic signals.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think became possible after you completed this study that wasn't possible before you did it?
I think for a long time, people thought that fMRI was too slow for language decoding. And so our study, I think, shows that this is not the case, that we can recover a lot more information from fMRI than we previously thought. So we hope that this really helps move the field forward, especially in terms of like semantic decoding and non-invasive decoding. Like semantic approaches have the potential to open BCIs to new populations of patients. And so we hope that our work can increase interest in this field. Another big thing that I've learned from working on this project is that you can never really know like what kind of information that you can decode from a brain recording. So I think on one hand, this is an important lesson for like privacy and policy. So I think it's like never too early to start thinking proactively about how to make sure that decoders are used appropriately and like enacting the correct policies in order to make that happen. On the other hand, it's also like a really exciting time for the field that we're constantly uncovering new things that we can decode from brain recordings. And so I think it's a good time to like dream big about the types of problems that you can solve.
What would you say are the main limitations of your study and how are you going to address them in your future work?
We think our decoder is an important step towards semantic and non-invasive decoding, but we think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. For one, our decoder needs to be a lot more accurate. In our study, we found that we can generally recover the meaning of what someone is thinking, but language is nuanced, and so we want to get as close as possible to the exact words that the user wants to say. So we hope to get here by using like better models, by like combining our high level semantic signals with like lower level motor or auditory features in order to get more higher word level precision. We also think that a limitation of our decoder is that obviously it relies on fMRI, which is very expensive and non-portable. And so I think moving forward, we are working on seeing whether the same approach can be applied to recordings from more portable devices like fNIRS, maybe EEG. The last thing that we want to do is we want to like work with potential users in order to design interfaces that best meet their needs. So a lot of what we've done so far is a proof of concept. We just wanted to see if like language decoding is possible. But I think moving forward, I'd really like to work more closely with patients and kind of figure out like what kinds of things they would want, how they would foresee using this kind of technology. And we hope that that can help inform the development of our approach.
Mhm. How do you see your work on semantic non-invasive decoding unravel, let's say, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if you can imagine that ideal device, how would it look like, how it will be used, where, and who will be using it?
It's impossible to predict like where things can go and like especially like how fast things are moving. But I think eventually I'd like to see a world where there's like brain decoding technology for helping people with different types of language disorders and like brain disorders in general. I think it'd be awesome if the technology was like very accurate and accessible to anyone who needs it. And I think, again, I'd really love to see like strong protections of brain data and like regulations for what types of things brain decoding can be used for. Because I think these types of policies and regulations are important for maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks of this type of technology.
What technological advancements are inspiring you in your work, and maybe in terms of new decoders, language models, AIs, BCIs, anything that really inspires you in your work?
I'm generally like very inspired by all of the recent BCI findings, especially like BCIs that are actually implanted in patients and have led to true improvements in their lives. I think that's something that's really inspiring and something that I'd like to work towards. I think with like all of the advances in machine learning and natural language processing, that's also been really exciting to see. I think a lot of our work was made possible by these like new language models and like the application of language models to brain data. And I think generally like learning more about the brain, learning more about how like language is processed in the brain, how it relates to other types of information. I think that's all very exciting, both in terms of like motivating the development of better decoders, but also just like the science of it is really exciting for me. And like cracking like the code for how language is represented in the brain is something that I find really inspiring.
Yes, and I'm just thinking about you're working with the semantic representation, with the meaning, which of course also has ties with the memory, yes, and how the verbal information is encoded. So I think you have a large space to work with on language and maybe at some point of memory decoding as well. So very good, very interesting. Now, the question is about the skills that you needed for this type of work. Let's say people are listening to us, they will be reading this interview, and they might want to follow your footsteps and start doing this type of research. So, in your opinion, what are like three major skills that the person needs to have in order to do this type of work?
One very important thing for our study was that we just had a really great team. My co-authors, Amanda LaBelle and Shaylee Jane, joined the lab around the same time as me. So Amanda joined the same year as me. We actually joined like within weeks of each other. And then Shaylee was there a year earlier. So it was really great, like learning from each other and growing together. And each member of the team brought something new and important to our project. So I think like being able to work within a team and kind of like combine your skill sets, I think is really important for this type of work. I think like brain decoding BCIs require like very highly collaborative teams. So I think that's something really important that I'd like to stress. Patience is also important. There was often a lot of uncertainty with like where things would go. And I think it was important to like be patient and adaptable and creative when our models weren't working as well as we wanted them to. Another important skill is just like thinking proactively about like the implications of technology. I think especially in like a fast moving field with a lot of potential societal implications, I think it's really important to be able to think very carefully about like where things could go and who it could help, what the potential risks are. Being really careful with thinking about implications can help improve the development of BCIs.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of practical skills, of course, communication, working on a team, thinking proactively, in terms of doing the practical work of decoding, working on the data, what would be your three main skills that you think were absolutely imperative for you to complete this work?
Machine learning is pretty important. I think like a lot of the recent breakthroughs in decoding were in some way or another took advantage of new machine learning approaches. The field is moving very quickly right now, and I expect there to be a lot more exciting developments to come out of that. So in terms of like applying advances in machine learning to neuroscience and brain decoding, I think there's a lot of like very low-hanging fruit there. So I think that's something that's great to know. I also think that it's important to learn a lot about like the brain and cognition. So for instance, in our studies where we like train decoders on responses to stories and then applied them to responses to movies, like that built on a lot of like cognitive neuroscience work, looking at the relationship between these two types of information. So I think it's very important to like follow advances in the neuroscience and like psychology, cognitive science literature as well. I think that can lead to a lot of really important insights. And then I think just like being very organized with your code, like especially if it's a big project with a lot of people, if you're collecting a lot of like data, I think it's important to just like be very organized and careful there. I think that will help a lot of like debugging time.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned following advances on your topic in literature. How do you do that? Maybe you can share your experience. Did you read, certain articles frequently, 2-3 times a week, once a month, or maybe listening to something? Just if you can share your experience with our listeners.
Something I like about our lab is we have a papers channel in our Slack that's really active. So whenever there's like a new paper in our field or in an adjacent field, they'll get posted there. And so I read a lot of papers that get posted there. I think it's also one of the advantages in working in a multidisciplinary lab. So a lot of people in the lab have a lot of different interests. So you see not only what's going on in your field, but also what's going on in other fields. And that can lead to like occasional inspiration. I also like just reading textbooks and review papers. I think it's good to get like a foundation and like a kind of like a historical understanding of the field. And I guess like on Twitter, I'll read just like tweets about like new papers. I think that's something that's also quite useful.
Absolutely. And now we are talking within the BCI Award series. So my question to you is, what motivated you to submit your study for the BCI Award?
I guess our study felt very different from a lot of the other submissions that I've seen. So I think our study is like a lot earlier stage. It's also like a proof of concept. We're not really working with patients yet. And we're also working with like fMRI, which isn't usually used in BCI research. But I thought it'd be really nice to start like engaging with the community, to start like sharing our work with different types of people, like especially as we start working towards making our decoder more practical. So I guess those were the main motivations, just to be able to talk to like a very different group of people from who I usually present my work to.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think helped you or your study to be nominated for the award?
A lot of it was just like trying to frame the possible uses of our technology, especially since right now it's just a proof of concept. I think it helped to like think about the types of users that we could help and like think carefully about like what our approach might offer over existing approaches. And yeah, just like communicating effectively. I think making the videos really fun. Like really taking your study and finding the most like important, relevant parts to share with different people.
And how useful do you think this submission was for you or maybe your team?
Yeah, I thought this was really useful. I thought the ceremony was a great experience. I thought it was really great seeing what other people in the community were doing. Again, I thought it was really nice to have the opportunity to present our work to like a pretty different group of people from what I'm used to talking to. And yeah, moving forward, I think I would just like to keep on engaging more with this community.
Yeah, thank you. And for those who are considering their submission, but maybe they're still on edge whether they should or whether they shouldn't, what would be your recommendation? Words of wisdom.
Yeah, I think if you're considering this, it's definitely an interesting experience. When writing your application and making your video, it helps you like single out the important parts of your project. It's just worth doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry. And as we are nearing the end of our recording, can you please share anything with our listeners? You know, your last words on this podcast this time. Anything you want to share?
It's like a really exciting time to be working in brain decoding and brain-computer interfaces. I'm really excited to see where the field goes. Yeah, in the near future, I'm really excited at what new advances will happen.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It was a great pleasure talking to you. I appreciate all the insights you provided to our listeners. And of course, I wish you and your team all possible success. And I will be following your work definitely from now on, because I think it's really, really very promising. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
Are you a fearless pioneer in the world of brain-computer interfaces? Do you have an amazing project that's pushing the boundaries of what's possible? Then we want to hear from you. The International BCI Award is one of the biggest and most prestigious awards in the BCI world, and the deadline for submission is September 1st. But don't worry, you don't need a top-notch budget or equipment to be a nominee or a winner. All it takes is a great idea and the determination to make the impossible possible. So, submit your project now at bci-award.com or find the link in our podcast notes and join us on this incredible journey to explore the world of BCIs. And make sure to listen to our upcoming BCI Award Neurocareers podcast series for tips and tricks on creating a successful submission. Who knows? You might be the next nominee or winner of the International BCI Award and proudly showcase your nomination on your resume to impress potential employers and establish a successful career in neurotechnologies. But don't stop there. If you are looking for more guidance on succeeding in neurocareers, book a free consultation with me, your podcast host, Dr. K, at the Institute of Neuro Approaches. So, what are you waiting for? Let's make the impossible possible together.